My paper this afternoon seeks to establish a link between theories of formalism and abstraction in the practice of classicism in early 20th century Britain and the United States. I may say some of the same things that David Ribera said in his very learned and excellent paper already. But I would like to try to demonstrate this connection by examining some of the places where critics and classical architects interacted with formalism directly. I think many scholars of this period will already recognize this, but it is particularly interesting because if accepted as true, a major driving philosophy behind progressive classical design of this period is shown to be the same philosophy that was also a major driving force of the so-called international modernists, such as Le Corbusier. I would like to begin by examining three classical buildings built between 1910 and 1940, with a particular eye to their formal characteristics. The first is the house that Giles Gilbert Scott, architect of Liverpool Cathedral, the Red Telephone Kiosk, and Battersea Power Station, built as his own residence in 1924. Constructed on the site of a former stable, it was a house that subverted expectations. Whereas the archetypal London townhouse was tall and narrow with a garden behind, Scott's house was wide and low and set back from the road with its garden on the side. The house was built directly against the rear property line, with an integral garage opening directly into the alley. A stack of rectilinear blocks, the wide horizontal mass of gray-pink bricks on its narrow plinth, was sliced by the first-floor terrace. The hipped roof sat also on its own thin plinth, maintaining the clean lines and stepping back to make space for gutters hidden in the cornice. Each layer was different, and each stepped back, the underlying logic consistently applied. The windows, too, were all different. Nowhere on the facade did the window edges align vertically or have the same width, but they were ordered by careful symmetry. How could such a house read as Neo-Georgian? Gone were the tall, narrow proportions of the 18th century London terraced house. Gone the alignments and gradually reducing window sizes. Instead, the masses of the house itself gradually reduced through stepbacks. Even the color of the bricks was unusual for London. And yet, it did seem contextual, and it did read as Neo-Georgian. One could only claim that the style had been reduced to its abstract elements, because what would have seemed to be its defining motifs simply were not there. It was new, abstract, surprising, and yet it contained the spirit of the London house. It was the first single-family house ever to receive the London Architecture Medal. Scott mounted the round lead award plaque in the center of the first-floor terrace so as not to disrupt the symmetry. The house must have spoken to something deep in the psyche of the age to so enthuse the judges. The architect in Building News thought that most families would have found it perfect for their needs. Country Life, the Architectural Review, and others hailed it as one of Giles Gilbert Scott's most brilliant creations. Acclaim was so widespread that the Australian architect Raymond McGrath even included it in his book 20th Century Houses, one of the few houses in the book that could not be classed as modernist in style. The second building I want to look at is Middleton Park, a country house by Edwin Lutyens, who, like Scott, had considerable international fame at the time of its design. The west facade features Lutyens' famous disappearing pilasters. He defines the pilasters with a single edge. The complex, specific geometry of the Doric order and the abstract, pure geometry of the plane it occupies are fused together into one element. Is it planar wall or point support? Ornament or structure? Similar to the game played by cubists, it is at once background and foreground. In the forecourt, the rustication around the side entrances similarly disappears, being formed not by massive carved blocks projecting from the wall, but by cutting shapes into the wall plane. His son Robert, attempting to explain, declared that his father's architecture was derived from a system of abstract geometry, an armature of planes, from which volumes were built up or subtracted to reveal the underlying primary shapes. He defined architecture as, quote, an essentially formal art, largely concerned with cubic volumes, which are subject in the first place to natural geometric laws. Not everyone felt this helped to clarify things. The English architectural writer Christopher Hussey tried the more straightforward label elemental classicism. Whatever they called it, contemporary critics clearly recognized Lutyens' genius as a sculptor of form. The third building I will present to you is the Leeds Mausoleum in New York's Woodlawn Cemetery. Designed in 1910 by John Russell Pope, architect of the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., the mausoleum has a groove in the facade that creates a similar ambiguity between pilaster and wall. Here also, we have the cubic stepped volumes, the peeling away of layers, and the pure shapes identified by Robert Lutyens. These buildings all show characteristics associated with formalism, the theory that the abstract elements of art, the rhythm, line, mass, and color of a composition, were what triggered an aesthetic or emotional response in the viewer. Abstract forms could have associational meanings layered on through figurative subjects, but those were individually or culturally specific. Abstract qualities were global in their appeal. This was linked to artistic theories about the nature of abstraction, about faceted planar surfaces, about the tension between foreground and background, solid and void, about the impact of the abstract form on emotions via the unconscious. It rather surprised me to find that there was a group of early 20th century architects practicing in classical styles in Britain and the United States who demonstrated a distinct interest in formalism and other theories of abstraction in their architectural work. It is interesting because many historians seem to think that only modernists were interested in these ideas and that they were the territory of German theorists such as Wilhelm Wöhringer and were largely ignored in the English-speaking world. Surely these historians would claim when ideas are mentioned in relation to classical work, as with Robert Lutyens' book in the 1940s, it is a post-rationalization, in his case an attempt at legitimating his father's work in reference to fashionable theories. Yet the John Russell Pope Mausoleum shows the same concerns in 1910, long before such theories can be considered fashionable. The question then becomes, if it is possible to find a direct link between formalist theories and these architects, did they talk about these ideas? Were they interacting with artists and writers developing them? And what did critics of the time have to say? It turns out that Giles Gilbert Scott had a direct link to Roger Fry, the British critic who, along with Clive Bell, had coined the term significant form that was used in the United Kingdom to describe this theory. When Roger Fry designed his own house, Durbin's, in 1908 near Guildford, he attempted to incorporate the ideas of continental cubist sculptors, such as Raymond Duchamp-Villon, who had applied the faceted planes of cubist sculpture to architectural details. The results, when applied to English architecture, was simply a Neo-Georgian box with blocky masses where there should have been moldings. But Scott saw Fry as a kindred spirit and was intrigued by his work. In 1913, he decided to explore these ideas further by designing his own version of Durbin's, a house called Grey Wings at Ashstead in Surrey, only a few miles from the original. Scott took Fry's design and folded it into a butterfly plan, crowning the house with a similar mansard roof and similar blocky moldings. Like Durbin's, he placed the house on the northern part of the lot to maximize the southern sun and warm the garden, and he broke with Georgian precedent to include tall windows on the rear facade overlooking the garden. Like Durbin's, where the Bloomsbury Group artist Vanessa Bell had reveled in bareness and austerity, Scott's interiors were plain, with hard surfaces and no moldings to dust. He would go on to express further interest in Cubism, making an architectural sculptor carving a crucifix at St. Maugold's Ramsey to facet the surface of the sculpture, corresponding by letter with radical British sculptors such as Frank Dobson, and commissioning Edward Carter Preston to do the sculptures at Liverpool Cathedral, an artist who had experimented with painting Cubist-style still lifes and whom Scott declared to have avoided the pitfalls of, quote, the sloppy clay school of realist modeling. Intriguingly, the American architect Bertram Grosvenor Goodhue, designer of the Nebraska State Capitol and the Los Angeles Central Library, wrote that it was the publication of Giles Gilbert Scott's revised competition design for Liverpool Cathedral in 1904 that had first inspired his own interest in expressing cubic masses in his work. Goodhue later recalled that the published drawings of the cathedral, with its clean lines created by lowering roof profiles and stripping away pinnacles, transformed his thinking about architecture. Scott was exploring such compositions of cubic masses before any significant English publication of Frank Lloyd Wright's work and before the publication of Roger Fry's 1909 An Essay in Aesthetics or Wilhelm Wöhringer's 1908 Abstraction and Empathy. In the 2 decades following the publication of his Liverpool designs, Scott corresponded about these concepts with Goodhue, about the search for universal architecture through abstraction. The letters survive at Avery Library at Columbia University in New York. Goodhue and Scott shared a vision for modern architecture, interpreting tradition in terms of ideal types. For Scott and Goodhue, style was the alternative clothing of basic forms, and by the 1920s, they were seeking to create the architectural equivalent of the ideal nude. Critic Howard Walker wrote that Goodhue, quote, stated frankly that he felt architectural expression reached its height in finely proportioned solids and surfaces, devoid of all detail except noble sculpture. This theory was particularly appealing to Americans because it said that a person's experience of art was based on universal abstract principles, principles that were an inherent part of human psychology, shared by all people regardless of background or cultural beliefs. Therefore, art and architecture, by embracing a concern with significant form, could become pan-cultural, an apposite for multicultural modern democracy. I would also assert that Scott and Goodhue's interaction laid the groundwork for uniquely American Art Deco, the stepped and chamfered masses and ornament carved directly into planar surfaces that defined the American style would not have been possible without Scott's ideas passing into American design via Goodhue. Hugh Ferris's 1916 renderings of the implications of the New York zoning ordinance and Eliel Saarinen's Tribune Tower entry of 1922 were also major contributors, of course, but Goodhue's treatment of ornament and his chamfered corners were an essential ingredient. Incidentally, it was this sort of Art Deco, particularly Ralph Walker's Barclay Vasey building for the New York Telephone Company, that Lutyens liked best when he visited the United States to accept the AIA Gold Medal in 1926. How did critics explain the link between formalism and architecture? Charles Riley, professor of architecture and director of Britain's leading architecture school, believed this interest in formalism was American in origin. The first book ever published in Britain about an American architecture, an architecture firm, was Riley's McKim, Mead and White of 1924. Its brief text put forth the argument that American classicism was exciting and indeed a model for Britain and the rest of Europe because it had stripped away national characteristics in order to expose the underlying universals. Such universality was, Riley argued, the result of American multiculturalism. Charles Marriott, who wrote for The Times, explained in his 1924 book on modern British architecture that architecture was an inherently abstract and three-dimensional art. He applied Clive Bell's ideas directly to architecture, declaring that architecture had much to learn from Cubism and Post-Impressionism. Quote, "The art of architecture is the creation of significant form in three dimensions," he wrote. Modern technology, he wrote, made it possible to treat architecture as abstract three-dimensional sculpture. Steel frames allowed architects to shape the large masses of a building and naturally inclined them towards cubic forms, while the masonry cladding of those forms, whether stone, terracotta, or brick, allowed craftsmen to shape the smallest parts and details. Thus, every aspect of the building, from the large scale to the small scale, could become part of a unifying and harmonious system of interrelated proportions and forms. Architecture should be designed three-dimensionally, he wrote, rather than simply projected up from a three-dimensional plan. In Marriott's schema, the plan of a building and the sculpting of a building were separate operations. Careful contemplation of mass gave the building aesthetic power and emotional impact that a mere consideration of diagrammatic function could not. Combined with truth to materials, by which he seemed to mean consideration of its formal and color properties, it allowed the architecture to take on the same properties as modern sculpture. I only have a minute left, so I'm going to speed ahead here. But the major points I wanted to make were that the most obvious language for a formalist system of architecture, according to Marriott, Riley, and other English critics of the time, was the language of classicism, because they felt that classicism was the perfect abstract architecture because of its refinement over many centuries. And this, of course, is coming out of the theories of Hermann Mutesius and Gottfried Semper and other German theorists. And they were especially interested in Greek architecture and took the details of Greek architecture in their buildings. Here is the National Academy of Sciences by Goodhue, which you can see takes Greek detail. Scott took Greek detail whenever he was working in classicism. And Le Corbusier, too, obviously was familiar with this theory and talked about the refinement of Greek temples very famously in Towards a New Architecture. And himself had originally been a proponent of an international classical style. Many of Corbusier's generation held on to this ideal of an international classicism and felt that it was a special ideal to be striven for. And I realize I'm out of time, so I'll wrap up now with with Arthur Davis, who was the British partner of the French architect Charles Mevis, who designed the London Ritz, the Royal Automobile Club, and many other landmarks in 20th century London. And Mevis, of course, did the Ritz in Madrid as well. And Davis wrote that non-national cosmopolitan classicism was the most helpful architectural development of his lifetime, the most hopeful thing that he had seen in the world of building, because it created a cosmopolitan style that could be shared by all people through this application of abstract universals. So I'll wrap up there and read my essay in the published proceedings, and you can find out more about this fascinating subject. Thanks very much.